So, good afternoon to everyone. We're going to run this Latin American session, which I hope is interesting for the audience. And it should be interesting by definition, because if I'm not mistaken, this should be one of the few panels in the industry, if not the only one, that I've seen at least, regarding Latin America, with no one of us being from there. The usual panels are with lawyers coming from there, updating the audience with the latest regulatory issues, and that's not going to be the case. What I would like to achieve with this panel is that you have the view of two of the big names of the industry, the angle from outside about this continent, about how they are entering into the market, about how is their perception of Latin America. So they're very well known, but of course I have to introduce them. Next to my left is Francesco Rodano from Playtech, Chief Policy Officer. And next to his left is Martin Lycka, Director of Regulatory Affairs at GVC. In order to set up the scene, I would like to, in the first place, ask you what are your companies, what are the recent activities that they are developing or carrying out in Latin America?
Okay, I'll start. I don't come from Latin America, but I'm Italian, so close enough. I have a Latin blood, so I feel close to that. Mm-hmm. So Latin America is mostly unregulated still, and my company, Playtech, is focused especially on regulated markets. Last year, we got almost 80% of regulated revenue out of the total revenue. So that's why, at the moment, there are limited countries in which we operate, which are the ones where there's a regulation. Mm-hmm. So there's Mexico, mm-hmm. very old regulation, but there, where we have a strong partnership with the biggest local operator, mm-hmm. Caliente. And there's Colombia. Mm-hmm. You know something about that. And it's, we just announced a partnership with the largest local Colombian operator, which is WPlay. In both cases, it's retail and online. Of course, looking forward, there's a lot of potential new openings, mm-hmm. including Brazil. We are all waiting for that, and eventually Peru. And so we are looking forward to that and ready to operate there.
Peru is a great market, and actually it's a great market recognized by the regulator. It's not regulated, Peru is not regulated, but it's not prohibited to operate.
There are a lot of incumbents at the moment. There will be a proper regulation soon, let's hope, when the constitutional crisis will be solved. At that point, we can enter into the market in plain sight.
In the meantime, is Playtech in Peru or not?
Not actively.
Okay. Martin, what about GVC?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to what appears, well, the lights are out, so this really appears to be either an Extinction Rebellion gathering or a meeting of La Resistance, but we'll do our best to entertain you. I would actually argue that it's entirely logical to ask a Czech with a British passport to talk about Latin America, so I'll try to oblige. In my defense, I have the greatest privilege of my life is to have a Brazilian wife, so hopefully that's sufficient defense in that regard. On a much more serious note, I would say that Latin America is potentially a huge opportunity for us all, including GVC. We've touched upon Brazil as an example of a market that is expected to regulate in a very, very near future. There are, of course, others, and we will move on to discussing them. But going back to Brazil and perhaps to set the scene and put it into a context, the previous panel has very ably addressed some of the idiosyncrasies and issues associated with the US markets. From my perspective, the key indeed is that the US regulation goes state by state. I was dutifully reading through the Tennessee regs last night, and I suppose most of us in the room would probably happen to be European, and we don't necessarily have a good idea about the population sizes of the individual US states. But just to give you one key number about Brazil from my perspective, 210 million football-mad people who are expected to be subject to federal legislation. So no province by province, one set of regs. And that's why me, but also, of course, GVC at large, see Brazil in particular as a huge potential opportunity, provided that the market is properly and efficiently regulated.
Thank you, Martin. Francesco, at the time of doing operations in Latin America, what is the difference that you perceive? Difference in terms to other jurisdictions and in terms of bureaucracy, state lotteries, monopolies, etc.
Yeah, I guess it's not so different from Europe, because Europe itself, there's a very diverse range of kinds. It's, so considering LATAM as a whole, I think it wouldn't be fair. Europe, what's the similarity when it comes to approach to regulation between Italy and France, or Sweden and Finland, or even France and Belgium? All neighboring countries, but they all chose different paths when it comes to regulation. It all depends from a number of factors, mostly political ones.
Well, let me put it this way. A French or an Italian does not usually get 1 hour late to a meeting, you know.
An Italian, yes.
It does? Okay.
He's one. He can vouch for that.
Yeah, but I'm great now. No, I'm kidding. No, yeah, again, there are all the different kinds in Latin America as well. And when it comes to regulation, Colombia adopted a regulation which is similar to Spain, I'd say. Peru is going to adopt a model that's largely inspired by the UK. Or Brazil, they're going to, I'd say, US model with a Swiss flavor. So there's also, yeah, the same diversity that we find in Europe. It's also happening in Latin America. I wouldn't say there's more or less bureaucracy again. It's too diverse.
Martin, do you agree on that?
I actually do, yeah. I believe that there is a huge diversity amongst the Latin American countries, of course, at the risk of stating the obvious in an ideal world, although we indeed, as Francesco has just pointed out, we've tried it in Europe, and as an industry we seem to have miserably failed. You would like the new and upcoming jurisdictions to at least take a good look of what already has been done, and indeed Colombia is a massive shining light in the South American continent, in particular in terms of, because it has produced very efficient regulation that has attracted a number of operators, and others, I understand, are in the throes of applying for a license. So you would like to think that, as always, there is no need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. At the same time, going back to the respective points about cultural differences and idiosyncrasies, and also I would suggest the current lie of the land in terms of pre-existing, in particular, retail and land-based related regulation are the most significant factors that come into play here. So, because probably it's not a mistake, but rather a misperception of where we would be coming from as well. We'd like to keep it and make it simple for ourselves, and we would believe that in the absence of explicit online gambling regulation, all these regulators would be starting, well, Latin American regulators we're talking, would be starting from scratch. But as I've just said, I don't believe that's not necessarily true, because there's bound to be regulated gambling industry of sorts, in most cases land-based industry, and the land-based industry will have certain views on how things should go going forward. So that is I reckon, I would suggest that is very much reflected in the regulators' thinking, and ultimately also in the thinking of the decision makers, who for obvious reasons will have much closer links with the traditional already existing industry, as opposed to the newbies such as ourselves, who are only now seeking to enter these markets.
Well, we have mentioned, or you have mentioned Brazil, you have mentioned also Peru, two jurisdictions that we are, since long ago, expecting regulatory changes. From a business perspective, what is the best approach for a supplier and for an operator in terms of, be in these jurisdictions that are always about to approve regulatory changes? And what are the consequences of these delays?
Yeah, okay. It's, again, I don't think there's nothing new there. In general, Latin America is like Europe 10 years later. It's, we discussed the Netherlands.
Yeah,
so,
particularly if you compete compared to the Netherlands or Germany or...
There's a number of countries in Europe which have been about to approve for a long time now. And again, it's the same there, maybe with a 10-year delay. And so the approach is, for us, we don't do .com in Latin America. For us as a supplier, when it will happen, it will be all incremental revenue. So we see that as a good opportunity, every single market in Latin America. So that's why we are waiting patiently, but at the same time, we are trying of course, to do public affairs there intensively, extensively, to try to ensure that when it will happen in a sensible way. But again, for us, it's just a series of opportunities in the medium term.
I would say that the key difference is the fact that the industry, and perhaps I'm being very naive here, has already amassed and accumulated a wealth of experience, in particular in terms of what's gone wrong regulation-wise and what we have done wrong and all the lessons we have learned the hard way, and that applies, in my view, to both North America and South America, and actually, besides the commercial opportunity, presents us with a practical or regulatory opportunity to get things right in those countries from the word go, and hopefully, as a result, we would have some additional ammunition is a wrong word, but for the want of a better word, this way we could gain additional ammunition or experience that we would bring back to Europe to show some of the more obstinate amongst the regulators that actually if things are done properly from the very start, everybody's the beneficiary, including the governments, the regulators themselves, and the customers.
Do they listen to that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would suggest that in Colombia, having adopted a near Spain-like model, they have. Of course, we've touched upon Brazil a number of times. They seem to be doing their own thing. Having said that, I believe that at the very least they have taken the initial proverbial leap of faith in the sense that they are already aware that for the market to be successful, they will absolutely, it's an absolute needs, must to attract big foreign companies into the regulated market.
Okay, so these kind of delays, to what extent, this kind of status quo of not developing regulations, etc., to what extent they lead to the legal market? And assuming that that is the case, what's the position of operators, huge operators like you both represent, at the time of staying or applying for a license in a jurisdiction where let's say the regulator does not have an enforcement action against the legal market? You stay there, you suddenly decide not to apply or to go to the grey market or
Well, I would suggest that the ultimate goal is indeed to apply for a license and get regulated. And when we're talking about the black market, that usually is misperceived as a market including all operators that don't happen to have a license in country X, even in absence of applicable regulation. I would suggest, and again, that in my view is a broader point that applies to the existing regulations in an equal measure, that the black market is the market post-regulation, the black market of those operators that have absolutely no interest in or intention to apply for a license. And I don't mean to be regulator bashing here, but what I would say is that one of the biggest issues the regulated industry has faced in a number of jurisdictions where it has gone through the pleasure and pain of applying and obtaining a license is that there's a lack of urgency in terms of addressing what I called the real or the genuine black market, i.e. the operators that do not happen to be licensed in a country that has properly regulated, because that is the ultimate goal, to make sure that, well, the noble word for that is, of course, channelization, but that, in my view, needs to be goal of every regulation, because then the license operators and the authorities are singing from the same hymn sheet. They happen to be on the same boat, and all that is to the ultimate benefit of the customers.
Francesco, does Playtech as a supplier follow any particular policy in relation to these markets, or nothing that?
No, again, firstly, I would like to add something to what Martin said. It's replying to your question. The lack of regulation doesn't generate illegal market. It's already there. We can call it illegal or gray or whatever, but it's unregulated. And sometimes we overlook the fact that it's also retail. We are all like excitingly looking at Brazil as a possible future online betting market. But in every country in the world, and especially Brazil, apart from the UK, retail is a way bigger business. There are like 150,000 illegal betting shops or unregulated ones in the country. So it's there. The regulation will allow the government to recover part of it, and at that point enforcement is paramount. I had the chance to be there, regulating online gaming in Italy for a too long time, and the most challenging, most pressing issue from licensed operators was a demand for enforcement. Because no matter what, unregulated operators will always benefit from a competitive advantage. There's no taxes, there's no product restrictions, and that's why if establishing a sensible and complete regulatory framework is the best enforcement measure, then you have to add something to actually protect the licensees. And that's something we are telling the policymakers there. But yeah, we are not, we don't have any particular policies in place at the moment because we are not operating yet.
Okay, understood. Martin, some of the jurisdictions in Latin America, and that concerns to Mexico and particularly now to Buenos Aires. Well, in the case of Mexico, they do not request a land-based license in order to operate online, but somehow you need to have a local permit already in order to do it. So it's, at the end, it's a de facto requirement. In the case of Buenos Aires, it's still clearer. It says you need to have a land-based business in order to apply for a online license. I'm talking about the province of Buenos Aires. What's your take on this requirement?
I suppose I could give you a very cynical reply and say it's what it is, and that's what it is. So we would, of course, all the operators entering the newly regulated market, well, in case of Buenos Aires, and then, well, of course, the Mexican one is rather, I would suggest, a bizarre one, because as you well know, some of the land-based casinos have been granted extension to their land-based licenses into the online space. But first of all, eating my cynical words, these are the rules. So if this is the only way of entering the market, then that's the set of rules we would have to comply with. Of course, from the perspective of a pure online gambling operator, and GVC is no longer a pure online gambling operator because indeed, as Francesco has suggested, times they are changing and we have all moved on, and it's needless to say that what used to be the two sides of the gambling divide, retail and online, have been progressively merged into one. So it's an issue to address, and I would suggest that it's for every single company to do the maths and figure out whether it would be worth enter in the market under the applicable conditions. One final point I would make is that I suppose it's always easier to potentially lobby for changes from within. It comes down to willingness to come in from within the industry, willingness to commit to a certain set of regulatory and compliance standards. So a short answer is that if that's the rule, I would suggest that every single company, and I don't mean to be patronizing, would need to figure out whether it's worth their while and then make the decision either to enter the market or not to enter the market under such conditions.
Francesco, and what's your point on this?
By the way, the Belgians invented this, so it's not something new in Buenos Aires. It's, of course, it's not the ideal model. It's for a simple reason. It doesn't replicate how .com works, which has been successful for ages in every single country. But sometimes for political reasons, it's inevitable. So we, as operators, we need to adapt. We did that in Switzerland recently, again, Mexico, or even in Buenos Aires, we applied in partnership with the local operators. We just, have to cope with that.
It's not a deal breaker, you believe, the fact that a company that is not going to do anything in the business, just pulling the local business, sometimes really small land-based operations compare to what an online operator is going to bring for them.
I don't believe that in itself it would be an automatic deal breaker, as you've just suggested. It's also a matter of commercial negotiations. Again, going back to what's been happening in the States, with the notable exception of Tennessee, all the currently existing regulations requires what's called tethering, i.e. a partnership with either a land-based casino or a racetrack, and then we could be arguing whether mobile wagering restrictions or geographical restrictions to the vicinity of, let's say, the MetLife Stadium in New Jersey make commercial and practical sense. But again, these are the rules that an operator would have to comply with when entering the market. So the initial choice, I would suggest you would grab all the applicable requirements and other factors such as the market and population size, plus also reflect the cultural diversities we've discussed. Are we close enough in terms of our thinking about these markets to the new markets? Could we perhaps indirectly piggyback off what we might have done in a country, the lights are back, in a country nearby that has already been tested, and then you would put all this or throw all this into the mix and make a commercial decision. Once that commercial decision has been made, then stick to it and do your very best, apply for a license and make the most of the opportunity. That does not mean that the initial commercial decision may not prove to be wrong, but then but the bottom line from my perspective is that we need to be able to adapt and need to be able to react to any market and regulatory developments, which I suppose, or I would suggest, is yet another factor that we have not really discussed just yet, i.e. the fact that once the market has regulated, and that might have been the prevalent view 5-6 years ago, oh, it's set in stone, it will never ever change, and then off we go, and we'll be making a lot of money while being compliant with the existing set of regulations. Of course, these regulations change in dependence on a number of factors, governmental changes, plus also the inherent factors to the gambling market itself, the development and the maturity of the market. We would not necessarily be talking this loud and this much about the likes of responsible gambling 5 years ago. With the benefit of the hindsight, that's the beauty, it would have been the logical thing to have done, but that's why that I believe is a perfect example that illustrates that this is an ever-moving beast.
Well, my next question, probably the last one, is in relation to, well, when we take a look to many of these jurisdictions in LATAM, there is a lack of regulations or poor regulations, real poor regulations on advertising, on consumers, on responsible gambling. Do you believe that the current trend in Europe, where compliance levels are being more and more higher, where there's more and more obligations to the operators, restrictions on advertising, etc. Do you believe that this is going to have a real impact across the ocean, or do you believe that they will ignore this and maybe in 5 years' time, after they have launched the regulation, they will realize these things?
I think that
regulations like Brazil, which are about to be launched.
I think way more than one could imagine. It's we discussed this today. There's a lot of noise, negative noise in the UK, Italy, and many other European countries, especially on the press. But some of this noise reverberates abroad, even overseas. There's, a recent headline on New York Times. The UK is growing gambling problem. Or, in Madrid, there have been recently protests in the streets against the betting shops. And the LATAM media, LATAM press also reported that. So it's happening. And of course, that doesn't make the local policymakers any more comfortable when it comes to deciding if opening their markets or not. So some mistakes that were made here, actually, we will pay the consequences there. Unless, because it's all to be regulated still, the local policymakers don't let the market start in a more responsible and sustainable way by imposing some limits on advertising, because the industry couldn't self-regulate here, and maybe some more effective practices when it comes to serious responsible gambling.
Martin?
Yeah, I'm afraid that I won't make this panel too controversial, because I will agree with Francesco that, and I believe it goes back to what I was trying to say about the industry and others having a good, if not a huge, opportunity to get it right in the still emerging markets from the word go, because we do have the benefit of all the lessons we've learned from within Europe. And indeed, if be it the North American or South American markets, we could get on the front foot and prevent a lot of issues that we faced in the past, in particular in terms of the likes of responsible gambling and sports integrity. And that is, in my view, the only way of achieving that these markets are sustainable, because we don't want to be servicing gambling addicts. At the same time, we see it as a responsibility to help them to the extent we can. And by that I mean that they're also, and that's usually left out from some of these conversations. We'd be talking about responsible gambling tools and spending even more money on responsible gambling. Don't get me wrong, that's absolutely the right thing to do, but where is the customer in it? The customer still has a lot of decisions to make. We're of course here to help them, or help the customer to make a decision, but that perspective needs to be reflected as well, and hence the push for the likes of gamification of responsible gambling tests. The more individualized rather these tests are, I would suggest, the better. And of course we do have, as an industry, the industry has the existing technology that could be used, and whole wealth of data that can be used for these purposes, and can be used to these purposes also in the newly emerging markets. Or I would suggest that sort of a voluntary code of conduct or self-regulation, they do help, they do come into the equation, but first of all, there needs to be regulation that will create efficient framework for all this. And then the industry, just like in Europe in many instances, might be or will even be prepared to go the extra mile, but then that needs to be reflected or accepted by the regulators and the regulation, so that the bar is set equally high for everyone in the market. And I appreciate that this is a circular argument, but it does go back to what we discussed about the truly black market of operators that do not intend to apply for any licenses. If the bar in terms of responsible gambling and so on and so forth is set this high, then that will naturally weed out those operators that are not prepared to do it and will help us all create a sustainable market to a large extent, regardless of what jurisdiction or what country we'd be talking about.
Maybe the solution is to make responsible gambling practices and tools more visible than advertising. That's quite challenging, probably impossible, but would ensure maybe a longer term
use advertising, I would suggest use advertising also for responsible gambling purposes.
Maybe a bit mixed,
yeah,
blurred,
absolutely, yeah.
but
well, it would be, but yeah, it would be. I can think of adverts that would solely focus on responsible gambling. That's what I mean. So that what you get every Sunday, not in the UK, would be, well, you have your marketing advert, but also you'd have your responsible gambling advert.
Well, that might be the case if the trend keeps going like this way. You know,
exactly. We'll end up like that.
Okay, one last minute for each in order to tell the audience what are the most expected developments, regulatory developments for GVC and for Playtech. Francesco.
Yeah, again, like Europe 10 years ago, it will happen gradually, country by country, or unfortunately even province by province, like in the case of Argentina, until the Tierra del Fuego comes out. It's 10 people living there. It's, yeah, we are waiting and trying to influence the process together with actually the wider industry, because it's way more effective if we do that all together. And of course, we're looking forward to Brazil, Peru, Paraguay, Panama, Chile, and so on. The beauty of being a supplier, a B2B company, is that we can cater for even very small markets if we have a local client there.
Martin, I assume that Peru, Brazil, Colombia, of course, are interested for GVC. But what about small jurisdictions like Paraguay, Uruguay, Panama, etc.? Are those interesting for a huge operator?
They might be. As I've said, it would come down to the regulatory parameters that would apply. And I'd like to think that once we have become regulated in some of the bigger jurisdictions, that inevitably will always end up on the top of the list or very close to the top of the list. And we will have, or we would accumulate even more experience in dealing with Latin American markets and what we call the cultural differences or idiosyncrasies of the individual markets. And then we could apply it to the smaller jurisdictions. They're in a rather unfortunate position of being smaller by definition. So as a result, they might need to think not twice, but potentially thrice, if not 4 times about the regulation. I suppose going back to your initial question and the crystal ball glazing exercise, I reckon that we have not yet amassed the critical, or we have not yet gathered the critical mass of Latin American countries that would have regulated. Of course, Brazil will indeed be the big one, and Peru is a chunky country as well. So just like in Europe, if I were, and I'm not going to bet anything, let alone my house on it, but if I was a betting man, and probably helpfully I'm not, or a fortune teller, then I would suggest that once once Brazil, the big one, plus yet another sizable jurisdiction in Latin America, i.e. Peru, will have regulated in top of what we've been observing in the province and ultimately the city of Buenos Aires, will have regulated, then that will probably, just like in Europe, speed up the overall or general regulatory process in Latin America, because those other states, again, I'll go back to the US, somebody much more knowledgeable about the market with local experience explained to me that it actually works in clusters. So Pennsylvania has regulated, well, all the other jurisdictions there. Pennsylvania scrambled to regulate themselves. So to cut a long story short, as I've said, once the big one has put the regulation out of the way, hopefully properly regulated the market, then I would expect that the other jurisdictions, once also they have seen the benefits of regulating a gambling, be it online, offline gambling market, will be minded to do the same, and they might be minded, or even best advised, to do it rather quickly.
10 years ago, there were only 2 local licensing systems in Italy, in Europe, Italy and the UK. 10 years later, most of Europe is regulated. So, and let's hope we won't mess up there like we did here in these 10 years.
Finland's still resistant, otherwise we've worn down everybody else. Between the two of us, of course.
Any questions from the floor? I think we have time for 1, maybe 2. None? Okay, then thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the panel.
Thank you.